Hello and welcome back. This is the week 8 lecture. So today we return to Hollywood and we move to the post-war era. So just sort of following the chronology of the book, we have now reached the end of World War II. So we're really talking about sort of the end of the 40s, the 1950s, and a little bit into the 60s. So like the book says, this is a very transitional sort of period for Hollywood. There's a lot of changes. We're going to be talking about some of those changes over the next several weeks, but we'll get into a lot of that today. And our film for the week is On the Waterfront, which is pretty famous film starring Marlon Brando, directed by Elia Kazan. Won a bunch of Oscars, sort of made Brando a household name. I mean, he was already a star, but it sort of cemented him as one of the biggest movie stars in post-war America. And it's a pretty influential film. We'll talk about it in the second half of lecture. I wanted to start just by briefly covering our two chapters that we read this week. So After the War, that begins on page 436, and then right after that, Transformation of the Hollywood System. So after the war, that chapter mostly focuses on sort of the international scene. They talk about America as well, but it's just sort of cataloging what's going on in other national film industries after World War II. And we don't have to get too far into this. It's just part of the overall sort of historical overview that we are doing in this class. But it is interesting to note, and they point this out in the chapter, there was sort of this battle, of course, a figurative battle, not a real battle like we saw during the war, but this struggle between Hollywood on one hand and these European countries on the other, because Hollywood wanted to start exporting their movies again. They kind of had to hit pause on that during the war, but once the war was over, Hollywood executives, those big studios, they wanted to continue to sell their films abroad. And like we've been talking about for the last few weeks, that largely meant Europe. I mean, it also meant Latin America and other parts of the world, but Hollywood had always exported a lot of movies to Europe. France, Germany before the war, the UK, and other countries as well. So after the war, that did resume, like they say. The film trade between the U.S. and these other countries did pick up again, but it had always been kind of lopsided. There were always more U.S. films going over there than films from over there coming here. So that imbalance continued, and like they point out in the chapter, some European countries really wanted to change that. So this included both allies, like our allies during the war, such as France and the UK, but also Axis countries, countries that we were fighting against, like Italy, Germany, obviously. Those countries were really sort of economically devastated as a result of losing the war. So it was sort of difficult to pick up film production again. But those countries, particularly Italy, really wanted to sort of create their own film identity. They wanted to increase domestic production of films. And it was kind of the same deal in France. We were obviously friendly with France. They were on our side, but it was the same thing. They wanted to start making more of their own films, but like they point, directors, creative types, but as the book points out, a lot of audiences in those countries still wanted Hollywood films. So there was still a high demand for Hollywood films to be shipped over there, but there was also kind of a movement within those countries to create more of a unique, distinctive national film brand. So that struggle sort of continues throughout the post-war period, but sort of in spite of that, or maybe because of that, there really was sort of an artistic flourishing in a lot of European countries during this time. And the book sort of goes through several different places. Again, we don't have to know all of this backward and forward, but it is just sort of a helpful piece of historical context to keep in mind as we think about this period, the post-war period, and sort of what's going on. So they mention that, again, sort of Hollywood continues to have a lot of control over the film going of Western Europe. So again, places like the UK, France, Germany, and other major European countries that either were with us or against us during the war. But something similar was going on in like Eastern and Central Europe, where you had the Soviet Union exercise a lot of control over smaller countries like, the Balkans or like Romania and places like that. And it was sort of a similar thing. Those countries often wanted to sort of start creating more domestic film production, but a lot of the films that were getting shown in those places were Soviet films, right? Films put out by the Soviet Union, what we kind of think of as Russia, but of course they had this larger empire that they consolidated after the war. We had been allies with the Soviets during World War II, but very uneasy allies, of course. And as soon as the war ended, the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union really began. So they kind of had their own film style. The book alludes to it in the chapter, sort of called Soviet realism. And these were films, they're kind of propaganda films, really, with sort of overt political sort of messaging. And they were, of course, being produced, in Russia by the government, but they were also getting, they, were supported by the government, but then they were also being exported to these other places that were under Soviet rule. So there was kind of a similar struggle there, where a lot of countries like, the former Czechoslovakia, Poland, other places that were kind of under, maybe not Poland, but like Romania, maybe Bulgaria, places like that were still sort of forced to watch a lot of Soviet films. So there was still a sort of a similar struggle between sort of a localized film movement versus this sort of bigger power that often exported films to that place. So obviously Soviet realism had a big effect on those countries, just like Hollywood had a big effect on Western Europe, but there was sort of this beginning movement of local filmmakers. The Soviets largely prevented Hollywood films from being exported to like behind the Iron Curtain, like East Germany or whatever they had control over. Some people were still able to watch Hollywood films, but it was difficult. They were mostly exposed to Soviet films. So just keep in mind that difference. Kind of similar though. The US kind of had hegemony over Western Europe when it came to films, and the Soviets kind of exercised a similar control over like Eastern, Southern, and parts of Central Europe. They also mentioned the rise of neo-realism in Italy. We're not watching any of these films, but it is just kind of an interesting movement that springs up in post-war Italy, largely as a response to the economic devastation and difficulties that nation was encountering after sort of picking the wrong side in World War II. But they mentioned some prominent Italian filmmakers who, like in the late 40s, started to almost adopt this like documentary style of filmmaking, a lot of on location shooting. They were out on the streets, really sort of depicting the realities of post-war Italy. A lot of economic depression, desperation, struggle, and also just like bombed out places. There's a lot of fighting in Italy. So a lot of places got destroyed, got bombed, got shelled, got, ransacked after a battle. So they were sort of depicting that as well, often using real locations, non-professional actors in some cases. These films were very influential. They weren't just important within Italy. They did sort of get seen by other people, and they influenced filmmakers in other countries. There's a great quote in the chapter. This is actually in, it's still in the After the War chapter. On page 441, a good description of Italian neo-realism provided by André Bazin, the French film critic who they talk about a little bit. He says what the neo-realists in Italy were doing was they were sort of simplifying film technique to the point where mise-en-scene didn't even really exist. And the events of reality sort of spoke directly to the spectator. So what he means is, like, remember, mise-en-scene is kind of everything that we see on screen. So like sets and costumes and all the things that are kind of created, by the art department to make things look good. To make things look realistic or impressive or beautiful, whatever. So the point is, with these guys, they were out doing all these on-location shootings, they really weren't using sets or sound stages, and they were often using non-professional actors, so they weren't really spending money on costumes or makeup or hair. They were just sort of presenting things and people as they really were. So again, this was viewed as almost a sort of pseudo-documentary style being used for fiction films, and kind of a simplification of the visual language, sort of stripping it down. Not everybody loves that, but it was popular in France, and some people in the States and other parts of the world also liked that style and were influenced by that style that came out of Italy. So, like the book points out, despite all these issues and these sort of struggles with Hollywood or maybe the Soviet Union, the 50s were still a good time overall for European films. Not only were there good films being made by sort of young and upcoming filmmakers, but there was also this rise of film magazines, which is maybe a little bit of an old-fashioned concept, but they still exist. I mean, maybe some of you have seen them. They're sometimes oriented around a particular genre or a particular style of filmmaking. Like, there's magazines devoted to, like, horror films. There used to be a lot devoted to, like, science fiction or crime films. Not as many exist anymore, and of course they're all, the ones that do exist are pretty much just online now. But around the middle of the 20th century, this was kind of a new media. It was kind of a new thing. There were a lot of film magazines geared towards fans, but also some were maybe a little bit more sophisticated and sort of geared towards aspiring filmmakers, or just like, aficionados, people who really liked film, watched a lot of film, and wanted to learn more about technique, wanted to learn more about directors, actors. Like I said, some were more like fan mags, like they were more about like who Marlon Brando was dating, whereas others would be more focused on like the craft of filmmaking. But those were pretty popular. A lot of those got popular in the 50s. You had more and more film scholarship, like scholars, writing, books and articles, sort of treating film as a very serious artistic endeavor. This had been going on for a while, but it was becoming a little bit more mainstream. You had a lot more innovation. And they mention in France, we've already kind of done our France week, but they do mention this very prominent magazine in France, and the guy that helped kind of get it going was Andre Bazin, who they mentioned. He was a very influential part of the French New Wave, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And what's kind of interesting to think about is a lot of the French New Wave directors, these guys that kind of changed French cinema and rejected traditional French cinema and really embraced Hollywood. A lot of these guys had started out as critics, as film critics writing for these types of magazines, and then they became filmmakers a little bit later. So they mentioned that Bazin and these guys, they really loved Hollywood films, and I mentioned that 2 weeks ago when we were talking about French cinema. They rejected the sort of tradition of quality in France and all these sort of period pieces and costume dramas that were very pretty and expensive and nice to look at, but these guys didn't really dig those kinds of movies. They preferred genre movies or like B movies from Hollywood because they thought there was more individualism being expressed by the filmmakers. Now, I know you might be wondering, well, why are we talking about this again? But it's kind of an important concept that they helped to pioneer in the 50s and 60s that's still largely with us today. The idea of a film director as a true artist who has a unique individual vision that they are trying to convey to audiences. We sort of take that for granted now. I think most of us kind of know that directors are talked about that way, written about that way. But previously, going back to the golden era of Hollywood filmmaking, that wasn't necessarily always the case. Remember, in the old studio system, directors were like contracted by the studios. They were under contract to a particular studio, and they didn't always have a ton of creative control over their projects. They would often be told by an executive, hey, you're making this movie. Here's the script. We've already casted it. So go ahead and make it. Here's the budget that you have to stay under. Here's the timetable. Go do it. So they were obviously talented, technicians and craftspeople, but they weren't always necessarily viewed as artists. They were kind of viewed as more like skilled craftsmen who were following directions and sort of sticking to the budget, sticking to the schedule, and creating largely formulaic movies that audiences would like. And of course, the ultimate goal was to make money for the studio. But people started to challenge that notion a little bit in the 50s, and these French guys were focusing on certain Hollywood movies that they claimed were very weird, unique, different, interesting, despite that old studio system. So again, they weren't always so interested in like the big prestige films with a lot of big famous actors and the ones that were huge box office hits. They found a lot of inspiration in genre movies like gangster movies, or what would have been considered back then B pictures. Like, they were cheaper to make, they didn't have A-list celebrity actors in them, much cheaper, lower budget, but they were often very interesting. Because they were cheap, the studios didn't always exercise quite as much oversight. It was more like, yeah, whatever, it's a gangster movie, go ahead and do it, we'll make some money off of it. But they were more concerned with sort of the big prestige movies that would rake in more money. So the French critics noticed that in a lot of these genre films or B movies, there was a lot of technically interesting stuff when it came to like camera work or lighting or editing, some more interesting scripts, more interesting stuff going on with the actors. And what the French guys really valued, like I said, was individualism, this idea of individuality being expressed by the director, being able to identify a director as having a style. Like, this director uses this type of camera shot a lot. Or this director often, treats these kinds of themes or features these kinds of interesting plots. And again, that's not always how directors had been thought. In earlier times, they would, one director would make all kinds of different movies in terms of plot, maybe even in terms of genre, in terms of theme, because, again, they were just sort of contract players being brought in to make something, for the studio. And they had to follow a lot of rules. Like we were saying weeks ago, there were these sort of formulas and templates that were very important in the old studio system, and often directors were just being asked to stick to those. They were often based on genre. Okay, this is a romance, this is a comedy, this is how you do it. But these French guys were saying there's weird stuff going on the margins. There's more interesting stuff going on in these cheaper, low-budget films, and they were really interested and sort of motivated or inspired by that. And again, they identified some American directors who largely were working in the Hollywood system, but they weren't like the biggest names. But the French guys were like, these guys are the true artists. They're the true auteurs. That's the term they coined for a director who has his own vision. Of course, to them, there was always a man, probably, had their own vision, had their own individuality, had their own unique style. And that's what became important to them. That became very important in the French New Wave. And that would later become important to a lot of film critics, a lot of theorists, people who thought about film, talked about film, wrote about film. That idea did not stay in France. Like, it migrated, it came here, and we largely adopted it. I would say pretty much everywhere eventually adopted it, the idea of the director as an artist. And that's still with us. So they identified a few guys that they mentioned in the book. I don't think we're watching anything from these directors, but Orson Welles, Howard Hawks, who did a lot of westerns, Otto Preminger, Hitchcock, who of course was famous then and still famous now, Nicholas Ray. Most of those were American directors. Hitchcock was British, but he came to Hollywood. But not all of those guys were super celebrated during their time. A lot of them were sort of rediscovered by these French critics at the end of the 50s and then into the 60s. So a few other things that were kind of happening in the 50s and 60s. The book mentions the establishment of international film festivals. You guys have probably heard of some of these. A lot of them still exist. The really famous one is in Cannes in France. There's also one in Venice, I think, that still exists. And now there's a bunch. There's some in the States. There's some in Canada. There's really film festivals throughout the world. But as they mentioned, this was a very important step in sort of creating an international film culture after World War II. So these festivals were just places where a lot of different films could be shown, could be seen, screened for audiences. In some cases, they would be pretty big productions that would later play, in theaters and in various places. But in other cases, these would be sort of more avant-garde or sort of artistically distinctive films that would play in what they call sort of art house cinemas, like smaller theaters, maybe only in select cities. They might never get a really wide release, but by showing them at a film festival, you could get people interested. You could screen them for critics, and then people would start writing about them, talking about them. There might be a word of mouth campaign, and some of these films would later, possibly get nominated for awards and be seen by a larger international audience. And that's kind of the idea. And we still have these. They're still considered to be pretty important. They also mentioned that government funding was important, or government support, at least, was very important for the film industries in a lot of these countries after the war. You got to remember, the war was, of course, very expensive and very devastating, particularly for European countries that saw a lot of the conflict, in their backyards. So they were kind of trying to get back on their feet economically in the post-war years. So they mentioned that in virtually every country that we're discussing, the government either sponsored films or helped to fund studios, helped to put up money, or at the very least supported them. Like in the U.S., the government didn't pump money so much into Hollywood, but they sort of went to bat for Hollywood, and they made sure that Hollywood would be able to export their films to Europe again. So there was always kind of governmental support in almost all of these places, with the exception of the UK. They mentioned that in the UK, the film industry kind of suffered because the government really didn't pump a lot of support into it. It was all kind of, privately financed, so they didn't make as many movies in the UK, but they still produced some good filmmakers, and they made some popular movies, but they just couldn't churn out as many movies as other countries because they didn't have the same level of support, and that would change later, but that was the case during the post-war years. So as a result, a lot of Brits like Hitchcock came over here, to work in Hollywood. A few other changes, and some of this stuff is kind of interesting to note because we might take a lot of it for granted today, because this was a period where a lot of things that seem pretty normal when it comes to filmmaking or film watching today, this is kind of when a lot of that stuff became a little bit more standardized. So they mention as a result of the government's sort of antitrust, these antitrust measures that they were able to enact against the studios, a lot changed, with the studio system. There was a massive transformation. We see that in the second chapter that we're reading. And they mention a lot of factors, right? There was more international competition. Television was becoming a lot more popular and accessible during the 1950s. But also the government's antitrust actions against the studios, which I've mentioned before. Those had actually started before, like in earlier decades, but by the 50s, the government really finally took action. And they determined that the Hollywood studios were actually illegal monopolies. They were violating American antitrust laws by basically monopolizing the entire filmmaking industry. We were talking about this weeks ago with vertical integration. Basically, the government decided that vertical integration was illegal, right? The fact that the studios controlled all three levels of the film industry: production, distribution, and exhibition. the government said, you guys can't control all three. You're monopolizing the entire market. You can't do that. You have to allow for some degree of competition. That's kind of an important notion for us in this country. So that was a big deal. It didn't make the studios go away, but it weakened them. It took some of their power away, especially at the levels of distribution and exhibition. So like the book said, like the book explains, one of the big things these antitrust laws did was they created a divorce between distribution and exhibition. Like, you couldn't control both as a studio. Remember, in the old days, they would make the movie, they would then sell the movie to exhibitors, and oftentimes those exhibitors, the movie theaters, would also be owned by the studios. So they were just monopolizing all levels of this process. So that changed, and increasingly studios lost control over exhibition. They could still control a lot of distribution, but they could no longer control all the movie theaters. So that was a big change, the elimination of unfair booking practices. So in some cases, when they didn't own the theaters back in the old days, they would force the theaters to engage in what was called block booking, where it's like, oh, you want the new hit movie, fine, but you're also going to have to take all these crappy movies that we also made. You might not want to show those, but you have to, because that's the only way to get Gone with the Wind or The Wizard of Oz or whatever. You got to take all of our movies, not just the one that you want. So that was also deemed to be unfair and largely illegal. So all this stuff was changing throughout the 50s and into the early 60s. So like the book says, the studios still, maintained pretty significant control. Only RKO, only one of the big studios really went away and fell apart. The others survived in some form or another, but it wasn't like it used to be. And another big change that, again, we don't really notice anymore because it's just standard now, but a lot of film production just became more independent. Studios couldn't control everything, and they couldn't keep everybody under permanent contract like they did back in the golden age. So increasingly, when a studio wanted to make a movie, they would have to bring in a director, bring in a screenwriter, bring in a costume designer, an art director. They all kind of became more like independent contractors, and they could work for Paramount, and then they could turn around and do a movie for Warner Brothers, and then they could turn around and do a movie, for Columbia or some other studio. They weren't forced to only work for one studio for the duration of a long-term contract. So that might seem minor, but that changed a lot, because with more independent production, they were still working for the studio, but this allowed for directors and screenwriters to start to maybe exercise a little bit more creativity, because they weren't bound by this long-term contract. Studios couldn't control every aspect of the filmmaking process. So a lot of scholars say this helped to kind of open things up and make Hollywood filmmaking a little bit more diverse, a little bit more interesting, and often a little bit more artistically innovative. And we'll continue to see that into the 1960s and 70s. But don't forget that the studios still exist, and most movies are still getting made through the studios. Even if you have a truly independent production where a movie gets made outside the studio system, oftentimes those studios would still buy that movie and be in charge of distribution. They would sell it to theaters, but now those theaters are going to be independently owned. All right, so some other changes that we can mention. Color. We've already seen the rise of Technicolor. We talked about it a little bit with The Wizard of Oz, which came out back in 1939. So we had color going all the way back to the late 30s. But another thing that happened as a result of these antitrust laws was that Technicolor, the company, lost its monopoly. They had monopolized the color game. And they were told, hey, You can't do that anymore. So once they lost their monopoly, another company, Eastman Kodak, came in with a much more simple, sort of streamlined coloration process. And that was largely what got adopted by most Hollywood movies. So by the early 60s, virtually all Hollywood movies, all US movies, were in color. So with On the Waterfront, it's still black and white, but it is still 1954. By the 50s, you had a lot of color films, but you would still have some stuff in black and white. Within a decade of On the Waterfront, you really wouldn't have much more black and white unless they were trying to do something different, right? Color became the standard by the early 60s. And of course, we're used to that now. Some other things that we're used to, the true widescreen effect that we see in theaters really got perfected during the 50s. Just, advances in technology. They also developed the multi-track stereo sound that we also get now in theaters. Another change in the 50s and 60s was that those old-time movie palaces that were very characteristic of the golden age of Hollywood, they were largely gone by now, and they were mostly replaced by either drive-in theaters or multiplexes built largely in shopping malls out in the suburbs. So even now, so this stuff might feel a little old-fashioned to us now, but this was an important transition in the 50s and 60s. And it had a lot to do with demographic changes and people leaving cities and moving to the suburbs. That had a big effect on exhibition, right? That had a big effect on how people watched movies and how many people watched movies. So as the book points out, a lot of times historians will give TV the credit for the studios kind of falling apart and movies changing so much in mid-century. But they said really it had a lot more to do with suburbanization. Like the book kind of makes that argument. It was more about people going to the suburbs, so they weren't going to go to the big grand movie palaces anymore that could often be found in big cities like New York, LA, Chicago. Those were no longer the best way to show movies. The best way was to build theaters out in the suburbs. So they mentioned drive-ins, which are kind of outdated now, but they were really big in the 50s. Car culture was really exploding during the post-war years. So, of course, with the drive-in, you don't have to get out of your car. You can go, park, relax, and watch a movie. So those became very popular. Also, more and more shopping malls, shopping centers were getting built in the suburbs, and they would often include a movie theater. But these would be kind of what we think of now as the modern day multiplex, which meant you had usually at least 4 or 5 screens, maybe more. So obviously you could show a bunch of different movies at the same time. This was good business. You could get a lot of people to come to the theater. You could show some big budget mainstream hits, and then maybe some smaller films could also play. And these were sprouting up all over the US. So these were important shifts that really affected moviegoing in pretty profound ways. And also, they mentioned the age-based rating system that we all know today, R, PG-13, G. That didn't become standard until 1968. A lot of people think it's been around for a long time, but it really wasn't. We used to have sort of a censorship code, the Hays Code, that existed back in the early days of Hollywood, where you couldn't show certain things. They would prevent filmmakers from showing, a lot of violence or sexuality. That got loosened up right before the war, and for a long time, there really wasn't an official system to determine which films were appropriate for which audiences, but by the end of the 60s, they had it, and we still have it today. So again, stuff that we kind of take for granted today was largely getting sort of standardized and put in place during the 50s and 60s. So again, kind of creating the modern movie-going experience that a lot of us have maybe had. I know people don't go to the movies as much as they used to, but you've probably been to a multiplex. You've seen the rating system that we use, and you've seen widescreen. You've experienced that stereo sound. All of this stuff is now a standard part of the movie-going experience. But also TV. We do have to mention TV because it became sort of a staple of most American households during the 50s. I mean, TV existed a little bit earlier, but it was still kind of a novelty. It's not until about the middle of the 50s that we can say that, probably the majority of Americans had access to a TV somewhere, often in their homes. So, as you can imagine, TV was sort of competition for movies. And initially, movie makers and the studio executives were very hostile towards television. They didn't want to support it. And most importantly, they didn't want TV to be able to show their movies. So for a long time, there was kind of a standoff, but as the book mentions, by the mid-50s, this you kind of have a different approach. So it's really RKO, the one major studio that eventually goes under as a result of these antitrust laws. But that studio was owned by Howard Hughes, the really eccentric millionaire. You guys might know who that is. But anyway, he was this kind of strange guy, but he did a very important thing in 1954. He sold the studio's film library to television networks, giving them permission to show older movies. I think the archive only went up to like 1948, so they wouldn't have to pay like residuals to people that had made more recent stuff. So it was older movies, not recent movies, but they allowed those older films to be played on television. And of course, that starts a tradition that we're familiar with today, which is TV will show movies after their theatrical run is over. Right, so TV has to wait. Not so much anymore that we have streaming, but if you're maybe my age, or if you can remember the 90s or like the early 2000s, really up through maybe the up till about the second decade of the 2000s, you still had TV showing movies like on network television, but this would be about a year after the movie had come out. So you couldn't see it right away, but you could eventually see it on television with ads, of course. But that was a pretty big deal. And then in 1955, for the first time, you start to have movies specifically being made for television. And of course, that also continues to be a tradition throughout, the ensuing decades. You would have made-for-TV movies. And they would often be considered by some as not as good as the movies that you might see in theaters, but this is how a lot of these barriers or these dividing lines get broken down. So in 1950, there's a very clear difference between movies and TV. They don't really interact. 5 years later, some of that starts to some of those barriers start to go away, and you have a little bit more crossover between the two. And now you could argue there's not a whole lot separating the two, or at least in the way that we sort of consume media today. But there are some interesting kind of influences and changes to movies that were brought about by television. And they mention a couple of these in the chapter. They mentioned that because of TV, movies had to become a little bit more simple visually. They had to simplify their visual style so that they could be seen on television. So they mentioned that the center of the frame, of any particular, the frame being used in any particular camera shot, the center of it became the focus for almost all of the action, because that would translate to a television screen. Right? Before you were thinking about the larger screen, you could cover more space. So there might be stuff happening at the top of the frame, the bottom of the frame, something in the periphery, something in the background that you wanted audiences to see, or that might be important even though it wasn't as prominent as whatever was in the center. But they kind of had to move away from that because with a smaller TV screen, you needed to make sure that all the important stuff would be centered around the center of the frame, so a TV audience would be able to follow the action and see everything that they need to see. So that was kind of a change. Also, previously, movies were meant to be watched in this sort of longer, continuous sitting, whereas obviously with TV, you had commercial breaks, you had advertisements. So the book claims that filmmakers had to sort of keep that in mind and learn how to accommodate commercial breaks and the fact that their action was not going to be quite so continuous for TV audiences. Also, some influence from European films. Again, it was mostly our stuff going over there, but some of their stuff was coming over here. And aspiring filmmakers were interested in stuff like the French New Wave or Italian neo-realism. They were paying attention to some of that stuff. And the book mentions that, in a lot of post-war European films, you had a lot of ambivalence. You had a looser narrative style. You would often have less closure in the endings, right? Like things might still be left a little bit unsettled or undetermined. You might not have as much direct linkage between narrative events. So just kind of playing around with narrative, being a little bit less faithful to these old templates and formulas of classical filmmaking and basically trying new things, but also featuring different kinds of characters. They mentioned this in the book, right? Having characters that aren't necessarily always like heroic or villainous. Like in a lot of the classic Hollywood cinema, you had these really clear archetypes or these really clear type of character roles that most characters in films would fit into. You'd have the hero, you'd have the hero's sidekick, you'd have the bad guy, you'd have these really clear types. But in post-war European film, that wasn't always the case. A lot of the main characters or protagonists wouldn't necessarily be heroic. They might be sort of confused, they might be sort of alienated, somewhat ambivalent, like they're not really sure where they stand, what they want to do. And that was a little bit novel, at least over here, but filmmakers in the US started to adopt a few of those techniques, both in terms of like writing and like how characters were conceived, but also some technical stuff that was coming over from the European sort of art film of the post-war era, like kind of easing up on continuity editing, something that was very much standard in the sort of classical Hollywood formula. You wanted every action or every shot to logically follow the previous shot so that, audiences could easily follow what was going on, and it would all be very coherent, very chronological, because you were sort of trying to mirror reality. But in a lot of post-war stuff, they would use more jump cuts, which means you might skip over some action. You might see two characters talking, and then in the next shot, like they're in a car driving somewhere. Because you didn't have to watch them get into the car, right? You could just sort of assume that some time had passed between one action and the next. So it was almost like giving audiences a little bit more credit for being able to fill in some of the blanks. Like they can assume that some different stuff has happened in between these two actions, in between these two shots. They just didn't see it. Right, so like the book mentions, this was getting used more and more when depicting like action scenes, like stuff that might include violence, like fighting. You might skip over some stuff and like see somebody sprawled out or whatever. But also for comedy, you would increasingly see jump cuts, just being a little bit more creative with how you shoot stuff and how you edit stuff. That's happening as well. So that takes us to the film for this week on the waterfront. I'll finish up by talking about it a little bit. Very famous American film. If you go to like the AFI website or Criterion, like any of these places that like rank movies or like, you know, the 100 best American movies of all time, you're always going to find On the Waterfront pretty high on those lists. It's considered sort of a masterpiece of post-war American cinema. It's largely famous for the performance by Marlon Brando as Terry Malloy, the whole, you know, I could have been a contender scene. A lot of people know that scene, or they know that line, I could have been somebody, you know, I could have been a contender. A lot of people know that without even really knowing where it came from. A lot of people don't necessarily know the origin, but they've heard that before. It's kind of entered our pop culture lexicon. And Marlon Brando continues to be pretty famous even today. He was one of the most prominent sort of mid-century actors in America. And his character, Terry, is sort of a good example of these morally ambivalent, sort of tortured, confused heroes that we see more of in post-war cinema. Like, it's interesting to think about Terry. Think about his arc. When we first see him, he is luring somebody out to their death. Now, he doesn't really know that Joey is going to be killed by the mob, but he is participating in this mob action. He's kind of under the thumb of Johnny Friendly, you know, who runs the Longshoremen Union here in Hoboken, New Jersey. A lot of people assume we're in New York City here. We're actually right across the river in Hoboken. So close, but we're actually in New Jersey. Not only is that where the film is set, but that's also where Kazan filmed a lot of it. Kazan's the director. He's pretty famous in his own right. He had also directed Marlon Brando in A Streetcar Named Desire a few years earlier, which was an adaptation of a Tennessee Williams play. Pretty famous. That's the one where he yells Stella out on the street, yelling up, you know, into a window, starring Marlon Brando, Vivian Leigh. It was a big hit in 1951, and it really made Brando a star. He worked with Kazan a few other times, made some other movies with him, including this one. So they filmed a lot of this on location in Hoboken. So that's what gave it kind of this naturalistic, kind of realistic feel, because they really were on the waterfront in Hoboken. It wasn't a soundstage. It wasn't some elaborate set like we saw in The Wizard of Oz or Metropolis. They were out in city parks, city streets, docks. There were some interiors, obviously, shot on sound stages, but they filmed most of the outdoor scenes in Hoboken. So you have a lot of on-location scenes, a lot of waterfront shots that lend a lot of authenticity to the film. But going back to Malloy, you know, think about his arc. When we first meet him, he's participating with the mob. He's kind of a low-ranking sort of henchman. But then he starts to question that after, you know, Joey's killed, and he starts to wonder if he really wants to be involved. He's obviously sympathetic to Joey's family, and then of course he falls in love with Joey's sister, Edie, who's played by Eva Marie Saint. This was actually her first major film role, kind of helped to make her a star. She would later become a very famous actress. She was in a lot of big movies up through like the 70s. So he starts a relationship with her, starts to question his involvement, and eventually testifies against his former friends after they kill, you know, his brother Charlie, of course. And he testifies against the mob leader and is kind of blacklisted as a result. Initially, they prevent him from getting work, but he perseveres. He shows sort of strength of character, and even though he gets beaten up, he continues to kind of stand up for what's right. And by the end of the movie, we kind of feel like the combined efforts of Terry, the friendly waterfront priest played by Carl Malden, another well-known actor who had worked with Kazan before, and then of course Edie, they sort of defeat Johnny, and he seems to lose his support among the stevedores, the longshoremen who work the docks. So ultimately, it kind of has an uplifting message, but when this film first came out, it was really regarded by a lot of reviewers and critics as pretty violent, pretty brutal. The word brutal was used a couple of times to describe it. And it was thought of as this really kind of hard-hitting expose of the kind of organized crime and corruption that could often be found in major American cities. So we have to appreciate how timely and sort of contemporary the film was when it first came out. Of course, we're watching it now 70 years later, and it feels very old. It feels, maybe kind of archaic. But when it came out, it was actually based on a series of newspaper articles about corruption and organized crime on the New York waterfront and in New York City. It's a series of newspaper articles written by this guy Malcolm Johnson, I believe his name was. So that was kind of the inspiration for Bud Schulberg's screenplay. But it was an original screenplay that was, of course, again, set in Hoboken, but playing with a lot of those similar themes. But this was something that was very much like front of mind for a lot of Americans during the 50s. There was sort of this really concerted effort to bring down the mob, to bring down organized crime in places like the metro New York area, Chicago, Philadelphia, other major U.S. cities. And it was largely successful. Like the mob, much like the Hollywood studios, they still exist, right? But they were weakened. A lot of their power was taken away over the course of the 50s and 60s because of organizations like the Waterfront Crime Commission. And that's the group that Terry eventually cooperates with, and he testifies, so they can pursue justice, and so they can try to get the mob out of these unions, get the mob out of these cities where they had long had a lot of influence and power. So that might feel very removed from us, but that was happening in the 50s. It was a real thing that was going on in a lot of American cities, and certainly the greater New York area. So it would have really resonated with a lot of viewers who either knew about it firsthand, or at least they had read some newspaper articles about it, or maybe seen something on the TV news, so they knew about it. It was current, it was important, and this movie was treating it with a lot of frankness and sort of showing how violent and corrupt these situations really were. So I'll just read you a little bit of a review of the movie. So Marlon Brando gives the performance of his career as the tough prize fighter turned longshoreman Terry Malloy in this masterpiece of urban poetry. It is a raggedly emotional tale of individual failure and social corruption. And again, very much treating the personal failings of Terry early on, but also his brother and other members of this criminal organization. Again, treating it with more frankness than maybe had been typical in earlier American films. On the Waterfront follows Terry's deepening moral crisis as he must decide whether to remain loyal to his friends and brother as the authorities close in on these mob activities. Driven by the vivid, naturalistic direction of Elia Kazan and the streetwise dialogue of Bud Schulberg, On the Waterfront is an instant sensation. And it remains kind of thought of in these terms. It won 8 Oscars. It won for Best Picture. Kazan won for Best Director. Marlon Brando won for Best Actor. Eva Marie Saint won for Best Supporting Actress. And Schulberg, the screenwriter, won for Best Screenplay. So obviously it was a hit, and people still look at it as just a really well-made movie with a powerful message. But like I said, if it's still remembered today, it's probably mostly remembered by typical people. It's mostly remembered for the performance by Brando. Brando kind of gets lumped in with like other method actors like James Dean, like people in this was like an acting technique that came out of a particular acting school. And Brando was one of the first really famous like practitioners of it. So I think I've mentioned this before, but method acting, sort of generally speaking, is just the idea that the actor really wants to kind of immerse themselves in the character. So they want to kind of act like the character, not just when they're filming, but maybe even before production starts. So Brando was kind of famous for this. In an earlier film that he made, he played a paraplegic war veteran, and in order to really get into character, he spent several weeks in a wheelchair, even though he was physically fine. He just wanted to find out what it was like to be confined to a wheelchair. And he spent time with other wounded war veterans, and he talked to them, and he hung out with them to kind of get a better feel for how his character would behave and feel. So a lot of people thought that was part of what made him such a powerful actor, is he really inhabited the roles that he played. So a lot of people think this is one of his best performances as Terry, because he's many things at once. Like I said, when we first meet him, he's kind of guilty, like he's complicit in the death of Joey, and he comes to really feel awful about that. So in some ways, he is a little bit of a low-level criminal. He's somebody who, has obviously functioned in this capacity for a while. We learned that he helps to found like a teenage street gang who also race pigeons on the rooftops of Hoboken. So we know that he's had a little bit of an unsavory past. We also know that he used to be a boxer, but things didn't work out. And later we learn why, right? Because he had to take dives for the mob. They would put money on the guy he was fighting, and then he would intentionally lose the fight so his buddies and his brother, Charlie, would make money. So he's bitter about that, and he feels like he could have been a champion if it hadn't been for their interference. So he's kind of bitter, he's complicit, he's not the most heroic guy when we first meet him. But then he does kind of, experience this transformation. But critics were, and regular, viewers were impressed at how he could seem tough, defensive, but also kind of vulnerable all at once. Again, sort of showing the complexity that really does exist in most humans, but it hadn't always showed up in movies. Typically, in Hollywood movies, actors were supposed to kind of be a certain type of person. A good person, a bad person, a weak person, a strong person. But Brando was showing that you could kind of do it all, right? A lot of people contain a lot of those things all at once, and he was sort of showing that as Terry. But also Kazan got a lot of credit for his direction, for the way the movie looks. Again, it was described as vivid, naturalistic, again, sort of looked realistic. They really were on the docks. But also he was able to capture some of these love scenes with Brando and Eva Marie Saint. There was a tenderness, there was emotion, there was love, there was violence, there was suspense, intrigue. This movie kind of has it all. And also, the score, the music was provided by Leonard Bernstein. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. He's one of America's great composers, and there's currently a movie out about him right now, starring and directed by Bradley Cooper, and I think it's been nominated for at least an Oscar or two. Maybe not the film itself, but maybe some of the actors. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the Oscar nominations for this year yet. But Bernstein is kind of having a little bit of a renaissance. Of course, he's been dead forever, but he was well known for providing the scores for a lot of Broadway musicals, but he also worked in movies as well. So a really star-studded production, a lot of famous people, a lot of people that would have a big sort of big prominent reputations in Hollywood throughout the mid-century. But overall, yeah, this post-war period is really a time of transition. That older, rigid studio model in Hollywood is replaced by a sort of newer, more flexible model. And you have some new filmmakers and new styles emerging. We're going to talk more about some of these new styles, new innovative cutting-edge techniques next week when we start talking about the new Hollywood and we move to the 1960s and we'll watch the film Bullitt starring Steve McQueen. One of my personal favorites, just a really fun movie, and it will give us a great example of the continued change that we see in the 60s. All right, so I'll see you then. Get in touch with me if you have any questions.